All right, for this candle, there were some questions about merging surfaces together to create a solid, and I'm going to go over a couple of those things. Let me go back in history a little bit. So I think this is kind of how the file came to me. Ty was having trouble merging these surfaces together to create a solid, which is something we want for these forms because we're eventually going to 3D print them out. So one thing I like to do before I try and merge stuff together to make a solid is do a quick section view to make sure everything is sort of happening as I expect. I think probably the thing that's preventing these from merging together would be these disks are cutting all the way through our form, and we can't have that if we want to merge this thing together and stitch all the surfaces together. So what we're going to want to do, I think, is use this surface to cut away the inside of that surface and do the same thing for this here. And there are probably a couple ways that we could do this. Let's try starting with just a simple trim surface. We are going to use a mutual surface as opposed to standard because we're using a bunch of surfaces to trim one another. I'm going to pick all the surfaces I want to interact with one another, and then I'm going to go down here and say keep that section and that section and that section. And let's see what happened. All right. If I do another section view, yeah, so it looks like it got rid of the inside circle for both of those, which is good. So now I should be able to knit these things together. So I'm going to pick all of my surfaces and make sure if there are any gaps, I check these boxes so that it kind of like fills in those gaps. Now, once I pick all of these surfaces, if SolidWorks thinks it can create a solid, this little create a solid option should become an option. And when I green check mark, everything should be a solid. If I do a section, yeah, now we can see it's no longer surfaces, it's a solid. Another thing I'll want to check is, okay, so it says I still have a surface body. That must have been just like an extra surface, maybe used earlier in the feature tree. I do want to make sure that any extra surfaces get deleted before I end up saving this thing as an STL. So, all right, I hope that answers your question. The other question that came in for these candles was about this one, which kind of looks like a candle rock piece. And I believe the question was, looks like where these two surfaces come together, we're seeing like a weird bump. All right, probably what I would do to prevent that from happening, it probably has to do with the tangency of these things where they come together. Oops. So, oh man, try and like zoom in on these sketches a little bit. So one thing you'll want to do when you're using what looks like a bunch of surfaces, yeah, and sort of like knitting them together to make a complex shape like this rock, is when you set up your original sketches, you'll want to try and make sure your curves are all like tangent or perpendicular to the planes that they cross through. So like this sketch in particular looks like where it crosses this plane that kind of like cuts my rock in half. It's not perpendicular. It's not like, excuse me, normal to the surface. It's kind of coming through at an angle. So I'm going to go back in and find that sketch. Yeah, it looks like this is the sketch. And I want to make sure that like at this point, I'm going to like build in a little vertical line that my sketches are vertical there. And it might mess around with your overall shape a little bit, so you might have to kind of like adjust that a little bit to make it the way you want. Oh man. Oh, geez, it's like moving around a bunch on me. That's really weird. Another thing, so it looks like this might be just a spline. I've had better luck controlling design splines instead of, or style splines instead of regular splines. They're just a lot easier to manipulate after the fact. So anyway, now that's all tangent. I'm going to go around and make sure these are also the same way. So like I'm going to put in an extra line in here that is horizontal, and then make sure that my curves, if I pick both of these, yeah, we're like tangent there. The reason I want to make sure all of those are tangent is it will help make sure everything lines up nice and smoothly once we start making our lofts. So I would go around and just double check all of those, Ty. Oh man, so another thing you might notice is sometimes one of these tangencies gets flipped around and you might have to go back in and kind of tweak stuff. And sometimes you'll have relations that don't look intentional. Yeah, okay. So I might have to just like go back through and add a bunch of these other relations. The setup for this kind of stuff is probably the trickiest part. Once you have your lines in place, then making your lofts or boundary surfaces should be pretty straightforward. I would go through and do that for all of these. Add a construction line that is vertical or horizontal and make sure everything is tangent. It looks like you did make sure that these lines were tangent, but because they're not also like vertical or horizontal, it's just going to make your lofts a little tricky. Okay, so this sketch should be okay now. And you can kind of see, at least going around the edges there, everything should be nice and smooth. But we've got other problems, other things to think about, and that is like from the top view, like this comes through at kind of an angle, this one comes through at an angle, that kind of comes through at an angle, and that's where you're going to get these like weird kind of bumps. All right, so another thing we might try, so I'm going to maybe, I wonder if I can just like hide some of these surfaces and try something else really quick. Because you have a lot of great sketches in here, but those edges are giving you some problems. So if you can't find a way to make your sketches, you know, not come through at an angle, let's try something else. I like how you're kind of using, oops, you've kind of broken your shape up into quadrants. And there, actually, but let's see if we can do it in less than quadrants. Like, I'm gonna use both of these, get up to here, and I'm going to use this thing as a guide curve. That kind of looks okay. Now, if I might even be able to do better than that. Let's try something else. There we go. These two, these two, all the way over to these two. Yeah, I didn't think it was going to like that. Oh, maybe it does. Interesting. Let's try a guide curve. That is this whole thing. Okay, that's a little bit better. You can use like the end constraint. So this back half of this curve over here, if I open up start and end constraints, I can have it like force it to be normal to profile, which means everywhere along this back curve, it's going to try and force that surface to jump straight out. And I can do that on the start as well. See how it kind of makes it pillow? Now, where you were getting like weird bumps was where, like, when my loft is trying to make my surface come straight out of this like start and end curve. If my guide curve does not also come straight out, like here, it actually kind of comes out at an angle. You're gonna have like a bump. But by doing a loft that's a little bit more of your like rock surface at a time, you might be able to get something that's a little bit smoother. Like these transitions are definitely going to be smoother than they were before. So you could try doing it that way and see if it helps. I don't think you could do the entire thing as one loft. You'll probably have to do top and bottom, but that might help out. If it doesn't work the way you want, I would suggest tweaking your shape so that at least a few more of these like intersections go through tangent rather than like at an angle. All right, I hope that gives you something to kind of mess around with to fix this rock.